Okay, Duvid here. We are live with the Horde World Championship semifinals between Stubenfisch and Horde Coach. Horde Coach, a former world champion. I think he used to go by Entastic from the Philippines, now in Canada. I believe been working with more chess, studied the game very deeply. Expert on the rook shuffle, so we see some of the rook shuffle. And Stubenfisch has been one of the top players of the game since its inception. Since I first started playing, Stubenfisch has um, been in the top three players, really since the beginning. And I'm not sure if he played in the World Championship cycle every year, if he's played previous years, the first time he's playing. So it might be a favorite. Oh, there's new players. There's been a lot of players who have been putting a lot of work and study into the game, and Horde Coach, one of those. But you could see the rating difference. Stubenfisch is a huge rating favorite, although UA also likes to play 1 minute or quick time controls, and I think Horde Coach is coming out of um, Canada. Might originally be from the Philippines, if I'm correct on that. Stubenfisch, I thought he was German, but he has the NIUE flag. It's an island somewhere. So just go back here. A typical rook shuffle, although instead of playing h6, playing h5 with the usual g6, and then Stubenfisch playing the pawn sacrifice on d6. So if you play e6, capture on f7, and then play e6, you don't have to sacrifice a pawn. So here he sacrificed the pawn on b6, and we'll try to create a large center on d6. So it's not one of the main lines. So Horde Coach here sacrificing the knight on e7. So this is a rook shuffle line that I'm not familiar with, but like I wrote in my recent blog, that all of these, even the rook shuffle or the holding patterns, all of the lines are with the same basic goal. Just going to put it on the goal to clear out a file. So here, the weakest file would be the D file. So and capture the different methods, but the rook files are the easiest ones to clear out, and even here the rook file might be the one to clear out because you can't push the G file without giving up the So if, for example, you push G4, then H5 would take G4, and the rook will come in, and as trying to push the G file will cause the rook to be able to get behind the pawn. So the same on the A file. And so here also, the D file is the thinnest of all of them. That's the one that Stubben has to be careful about. So Horde sacrificing another pawn. At this point, there's already the danger of penetration. The pawn on E2 could be taken, and then the queen could be brought to A6, and then C4 could defend. The rook could sack. So at this point, I believe he could probably already penetrate. Yeah, so this is a penetration. Does Stubenfisch have enough compensation to overwhelm the king? Most likely on the king side. So he didn't even usually, like I said, the G4 and opening up the H file would happen first uh, before allowing penetration on the queen side. On this case, he's already allowed penetration before advancing the king side. Although, yeah, I guess he could just allow the bishop to penetrate, and he could play c4 and b5, or he could play b5 first and then c4. So I have to say this looks pretty good for Horde Coach, but it's 2 minutes, time's ticking down, and the king side attack is starting to happen. But if you just count the number of moves, these pawns, I mean, if we see the same line in the future openings, uh, Stubenfisch could have advanced these pawns before allowing penetration on the queen side, and because to advance these pawns would take 8 moves, 5 moves. Pawns advance very slowly, and although if the queen tries coming and taking the king side pawns from behind, then the the queen side pawns could advance with just the rook to defend against it. But I'm not sure if he could prevent penetration here. I don't think so. Because if he plays c4, then queen to a5. If he plays c4, queen to a5, and that will be a double threat on a2 and getting behind the pawns. And so I would have to say this game looks in favor of Horde Coach, but we'll see. Say both players are down to less than 20 seconds. There's a 2-second increment, but these king side pawns are going to advance very slowly, and the queen side pawns, even with just the rook to defend against the queen side pawns, take many moves for them to become a threat. But Stubenfisch is a competitor. He's not going to give up that easily. So instead of trying to take the queen side pawns, he goes for g1. Like I wrote in the blog, just safe capture the pawns from behind, and the a pawn's a really long way away. Although can he stop the queen from getting in? I'm not sure if he needed to sacrifice the bishop so quickly, if that helped him. I guess just with the purpose of getting the other rook in there. And that looks pretty good. Yeah, this is probably going to be GG. I'm not sure. I would have taken on c5 first, but maybe he was worried about a threat of a g6. But it looks like either one. This looks like good game. So Horde Coach, one of the current experts in the rook shuffle. So it's early in the morning. It's 8 in the morning. No one's watching. I spoke with Dude about streaming this. So Stubenfisch is not a rook shuffle player. He just plays the normal e6 line. And here, Horde Coach plays a5. If he hadn't, maybe Stubenfisch would have played a5 in the lines that I play, just trying to open the a file. You could still go for opening the a file, even though a5 is played. So, at this point, Stubenfisch has to decide, is he going to attempt to open up the H or A file, or is he going to get into a holding pattern? I mean, to set up his pieces to create a zugzwang situation where white has to come forward. And as I mentioned in the blog, to open up a file, you have to sacrifice 2 or 3 pieces in the same file. So, here as of now, there's only 3 pawns in the E file. So the E file might be the most likely target to try to open up a file, or the D file. You could sacrifice right here on C5 if you wanted. And okay, so Horde Coach could have played E3 to prepare D4 to not allow the sacrifice of the bishop for 2 pawns. So now Stubben could take on D4 and thin the D file down to 2 pawns, but chooses to keep the bishop. So here he'll probably sack the knight in F6, but no, he goes for the bishop. So it determines that the knight is more useful than the bishop, and the E file now has been thinned to 2 pawns. So the strategy this game will not be to open the A or H file, though sometimes that happens anyways, because like you see, pushing the G pawns weakens the side file, because you can't advance the G pawn without the G or B pawns without weakening the H or A pawns. So but here the the weakness is the E file, and he sacrifices one more piece and it goes down to 1 pawn. in the E file. So this is looking pretty good for Stubenfisch. Can he force Zugzwang here? Okay, Stubben did not want to take on f5 with the queen, presumably because pushing g4 would have allowed penetration of the h file, because once the h file is down to 3 pawns, getting the queen behind the rook would be able to penetrate. So at this point also, pawn takes hxg, and then rook takes h4 will allow penetration with the battery of the queen behind the pawn, then taking on h3. And if the pawn g takes h, once the queen reaches h3 with no pawn on g2, you will penetrate because the queen is threatening to come to f1, and you push g2 to stop it. The queen will take on h2 and g1. So here, the castle, and I think Horde coach just blundered maybe here and didn't see the threat of you had to play c3, although c3 may have been weak anyways, but he probably had to play c3 right away to prevent this, because if he takes with a pawn, the queen will get behind the pawns, and these pawns are not enough advance. So this will also be penetration. As said, if the pawn moves to g2 or g3, uh, the queen will either be able to take on f2 or h3. So he takes on h3, and he'll probably take on f3, and this looks like good game because, like I said, there's only a handful of pawns past the middle of the board. Pawns move extremely slowly, and just to move like b4, b5, a4, a5, a6 is already 5 moves, and by then all of these pawns will be disappeared. So this looks like good game. I'm not sure if Horde coach just blundered here. If it would have made a difference if he had played c3 and not given up that pawn, and Stubben probably still has the advantage. Black has a strong advantage in Horde in general, so you might expect in a World Championship level play to see about 75% victory for Black, and the tide will turn in the match with whoever starts scoring with White. So at this time, both sides have won pretty decisively with their blacks. So we'll see if Stubben keeps on going with the same line in the rook shuffle, and Horde coach, what he has with White. Okay, so assume we're going to see another rook shuffle here, and these are a 10-game match. I believe first to best out of 10, unless it's a draw. Then I think it has the 2-round playoffs. Okay, so this is the classical setup. You see here he played h6 instead of h5, and there's some small nuances in playing h5 that doesn't allow the g pawn to advance as quickly. And here, Stubben did not play these complicated lines by sacking a pawn. This is the only way to not sack a pawn right away is g6, because the h1 has been pushed already. Could be played without sacrificing a pawn after taking on f7. Then e6 could be played, and then c6 could be played, and then all of the pawns could be advanced without sacrificing a pawn, until eventually b6 is usually played. Usually g5 will be played first. Sometimes c2 is preferred. Okay, so he doesn't play the g5 moves first. And, this is, I guess we'll call preparation. This is a well-known position. As Cinnamon and Mindhunter had this exact lines again and again during their games. And maybe there was a slight variation on it but this is a well-known line, and your Horde coach will be able to penetrate here. So I think, I mean, usually White, before playing into this, could play G5 and G4 and even G3 and have the rook on H3 and advance some of the pawns on the king side by sacrificing the H5 and H4 pawns before entering into this. So Stubben does not do that, although he does have an extremely strong center here. And see at this point, if you capture on B1, A1, B2, A3, that is slow, and B4, B6, B7 is quick. Although if he does play B4, Stubben could come right back and play Queen C2 and try to pick off uh, C5, and can he get to B7? Um, I'm not sure. I mean, even though this is move 45, this is still somewhat preparation because, if he goes for B6, B7 right away, um, the queen will take on B2. So, here if you just see B6, B7, then okay, so I don't know the move here. Yeah, so he doesn't take, he brings the king over, and so this path allows him to hold on to. What happens if he plays E6? This looks winning for White. Now C7 is a mating threat, so I'm not sure. We might be able to look at the analysis board quickly and see if he had better. Um, so where did Horde coach go wrong? So I'm not sure. I guess I'm not sure why Queen. Okay, so the computer's saying he should have attacked the D3 pawn from either A6 or B5, and that way D6 could not have been played immediately because the C6 pawn would have uh, would have been taken. So going this way allowed D6 right away. So that was the first mistake, and then I guess here he had to start a waiting game, and um, going for the pawn right away. Stubben is already uh, winning. So good job, Stubben. He gets the first victory for he gets the first victory for White, and that will give Stubenfisch extremely good chances of winning in this match. So the first person to win with White, can Horde coach come up with something better? So we have a not the same variation. So here you have a holding pattern, a four Zugzwang situation where Stubben plays F6 and D6 with the goal of penetrating on the E file. And as opposed to the A and H file, so when you try to break open the A or H file, those are almost always forced, where you forcefully try to break your way through sacrificing. When you try to break open a center file, this one being the E file, usually it's through forcing Zugzwang in a position where White will eventually have nothing to do but advance in a way that allows opening up the E file. So, that could be an example with the bishop on G7. Maybe the knight stays back. Maybe this knight gets reworked to. So Okay, so let's see how this plays out. He could go to knight b6 and double sack just two knights for two pawns on d5 in order to thin the e file out to one pawn, although it's probably not worth it to sacrifice, because if he plays knight b6, then a5, he'll be forced to sack right away. Just two pieces for two pawns that would have immediately thinned out the e file to one pawn. Um, that's interesting. Going to b6, because obviously b4 a5 will be able to win the bishop for just one pawn. But he sacks right away in order to thin the e file to one pawn, and then he immediately plays f5. Obviously taking with the e file is not an option, and now there's immediate threats. Can white make progress, or is white in zugzwang already? For example, pushing e5, the knight will immediately take on d5 and taking back with the queen. And when you have the queen in front of a pawn, there's no way to advance without opening up. So I believe this looks good for Stubenfisch, but I'm not sure. Because the problem with the rook on the f files, he can push the h and g files now without the rook on the h file. Um, Although f4 becomes a target. Uh, but generally in these holding patterns, as we saw the last few games, is you could advance your pawn. So at this point, the only thing that Horde coach has left to do is push the H and A files, and then he's going to have to sacrifice and make an advance. And which one he wants to do is unclear. Because okay, now if he pushes G5, um, okay, so this pattern, like had he pushed G5 there, then by pushing G4, the pawn on F4 would have been prevented further G pawn pushes. So this way has allowed Horde coach to advance his pawns some, but the problem remains now that he can't push C4 without the queen taking on D5. Uh, okay, so that's now G5 is still a possibility. Okay, so he sacrifices, and the E file has been open, but the masses on the queen side. So okay, so Stubben goes for the knight behind on the queen side. Okay, instead of taking the pawn on the king side, Stubben is guarding the d file and b6. Okay, so what does Horde coach do? Like his pawns seem immobile here on the queen side, so he could start advancing the king side pawns, and probably the queen has to stay put on the queen side. So this looks like an interesting game. Horde coach might have good chances. He's got to quickly mobilize his king side pawns. Three pawns will defeat a king, so he will need to get the queen back in order to defend. It can your Horde coach advance. It really going to take 5 or 6 more moves. How much can the knight penetrate here? So I'm not sure. I might have played c6 there. I might have played c4 there and tried to save that pawn. Um, yeah, I'm not sure. I think if I were Horde coach, I wouldn't have given up that c pawn. Um, I mean, it might have been lost no matter what, but this is looking pretty good for Stubenfisch right now. I mean, there is still playing chances in this game. So now the knight has to come back and defend. Um, this could be Horde Coach's game. There's just a few seconds on either side, and if you notice, he could play A5, B3, and it looks like Horde Coach is coming through. So now F6, F6, F7. Um, the queen has to come back, and now B7, and it's winning. Okay, so I'm not going to look at the analysis board that there. Uh, I will assume that Stubenfisch probably was winning there and made some sort of mistake. But perhaps the Horde Coach. So now each one of them has won with white, and we're back to the rook shuffle. So let's see. Horde Coach, as we said, he missed the correct idea in terms of the D3 pawn becomes weak, and he needed to attack the D3 pawn while defending against the pawn push on D6, which he didn't do last time. It would have been a small difference. So we'll see if we get the exact same position. Sometimes you see players play C2 instead of C3 right away because the D3 pawn becomes very weak. So we have the exact same position. And so if you did knight takes, queen takes pawn, okay, so we made the same mistake, and now D6 is winning. So we saw, according to the computer, on this move, Horde Coach is supposed to play queen to B5, and it has the same threat of taking on D3, but the difference is that D6 can't be played right away because then the C6 pawn falls. Although, I mean, there's play in that position also. So here, Horde Coach sacrifices the knight right away, and now Stubben is advancing on the E file, on the king side. And, saying there's other ways it could have went because Stubben could have done this before sacrificing on B6. So when I play against the rook shuffle, usually I end up opening up the H file before sacrificing on B6. But, obviously Stubben, one of the best in the game. So sacrificing the F3 pawn in order to push D6. Stubben could play F4 here, because now D6 can't be played without giving up the pawn on E6. So F4 could be played to defend the E6 pawn. But first he attacks the rook. So now we'll probably see F4. And this looks good for Stubenfisch again. As a Horde Coach, somewhat opening theory, even looking back, I don't know if you'd call this opening prep, but this move here on move 44, 43 for black is a mistake. And you could, maybe it's somewhat middle game, but like you could still call that opening prep. So Stubben has a few options. He could go for D6 right away. Okay, he goes for C7 first. And so now there is a mate threat. So now if queen x G5, F7, king E7, D6 would be checkmate. So there is a mate threat here. I thought, oh no, the king could run to F6, so it's not checkmate. Um, but I'd have to assume that D7 is winning. Horde coach had a lot of time there, so he didn't use his time. Oh, so no, he's still defending. Bishop E7 brings the rook in, although the problem is Stubben does not have to take right away. So can he play F4 here? No, if he plays F4, then the bishop may be able to come back. I mean, is there a win here with F4? Obviously, if the queen takes, then B6. If he doesn't do something, okay, yeah. So just C6, but now the pawn on C7 is dropping. Although F4 may have been winning there. Like I'm not sure if he played F4, if he took with the pawn is B3 winning and threatening mate. So here he prepares F4. Although can Stubben run? Can he just take on C7 now F4? Just move the bishop away, and now he could run his king backwards. So this looks good for Horde coach here. Um, if he plays F3, he has to go back to F8. He can't take the pawn because then G7 will queen. So Horde coach has a lot of time here. I mean, he could also play king takes E6, and then if pawn takes G7, he could bring his queen back to D8. So the two options here. Okay, so queen D8 now. And this may also be winning. I'm not sure. Does he play something like bishop E5? Does he take on G5? Okay, so now he forces the issue. And Stubben only has a very limited amount of time here. Uh, so the bishop alone cannot stop the queenside pawns. A4, A5, B6. And if he tries to rework the queen, G6 could be deadly. So the queen can't get back to defend it. So Stubben could bring the queen. So he probably is going to play king F8 here. Yeah. So king F8 threatening the threat of G7, which prevents the king from stopping it. And now the queen could come from behind and probably capture most of these pawns. So we probably just take on F6. Okay, takes with the bishop even. He okay. Looks like Horde coach's game, but you has to be careful. I mean, he may be able to just take on B3, but I guess prophylaxis, bringing the bishop back. Now the king will be able to stop the G and H pawns, and I'm not sure that Stubben has a threat. You could. Yeah, those pawns are extremely slow. So he could probably just take on f5 and just take on e6. And bring the queen back, or this, and then just queen a6 here, and GG. Okay, Horde coach, 3-2 against Stubenfisch. In that, yeah, I'll check the computer analysis after this is over. I would have to guess that Stubenfisch had an advantage there, had some winning possibilities. So here we get Stubenfisch playing a5 this time instead of a6. And this could be the classical line, like I'll call the Royal Lopez of Horde, where the knight goes to d7 and b6, or here in this case, usually the knight will sacrifice. The knight will go to e7 and sacrifice the knight for 2 pawns on c6. So this is a book line. There's some variation. When I play this line, I would take on b4, and then there's a line where you bring your knight to a5. And the idea of moving the knight to a5 and then is to move the bishop to d7 and try to just open up the a file right away. Although I think there's been a refutation at the highest level to knight a5. You could also rework the knight back from b8 to d7 to b6, or bishop d7 with the goal of sacrificing a4. So first getting this dark square set up to slow down the king side. But I think bishop d7 is immediately threatening to open up the a file. Yeah, so he just brings the knight back. So now if bishop d7 and if he plays d5, b5, he could bring the bishop back to c8. Okay, prophylaxis, the queen to c7 to prevent c5, and now the knight will make its way to b6 and attack on a4, and the a file will be penetrated. Although, does white have enough of a lead? Yeah, I don't know why he would have sacrificed that pawn and helped the knight get to a4. That doesn't make any sense to me why he played c5 there. I assume he probably, to me that would probably a poor move on Horde coach's choice. He probably would have been better off just advancing on the king side. And I don't know why Stubben at this point didn't just go ahead with the sacrifice on a4 in order to open the a file and create the battery behind the rook. But maybe at this point, Stubben has changed strategies and will be trying to clear out the e file. So at this point, getting the queen behind the pawns, the kingside attack may have been too strong. And so Stubben has decided to just try to thin out the center pawns, the E or D files. So if you notice now, if white plays E5, then he'll sacrifice the pawn and knight of the queen. and then it'll be reduced to just one pawn in the E and D file. He could play G5 first and sacrifice the pawn in preparation for E5, but the problem also is that the bishop on B7 will be hitting F3. So when the pawn eventually pushes to E5, the bishop will be hitting F3. And you could also try uh, D5 first. So this is looking good for Stubenfisch here. Uh, Horde coach is approaching his Zugzwang position. Although, maybe he's got choices C5, C4, D5. So, he's sacrificing a few pawns here and there. So when you have these holding type patterns, eventually you reach a position where you have to sacrifice a pawn. And the strategy, usually sacrifice a pawn to clear a path so that your thinned file won't be opened. And so, usually the pawn that you're going to sacrifice is going to be the G or F pawn or the C or B pawn because those start with 5 pawns and are the hardest files to thin. So Stubben eventually now finally gets behind the pawns. So probably going to see E5, maybe G5, and a rapid attempt to advance these pawns in the center. He probably does not want to take here, although G5 will be coming right away. Taking's, usually when you're black, you don't want to take the pawns, because that helps you lose a tempo. When you take by forcing white to take, you gain a tempo. Uh, Going forward by taking, white takes back and gains a tempo. So it looks like a standstill. So this should be Stubben's game. The queen is guarding all these pawns. B4 if eventually pushed. Horde coach just resigns. Okay, back to the rook shuffle. Okay, so let's see if Horde coach makes the same error. I'm going to assume it's an error. I'm going to go with the computer. It seems logical to me that it's an error. On move 43 or 44, where he's been playing queen b3 instead of b5, which prevents the d6 advance. But no, Stubben does not play the same line. We'll call it the main line of the rook shuffle, which first advances on the white square, and he sacrifices the d pawn right away. So this looks slightly different than the first game. The first game where Horde coach won pretty convincingly. I think we have a slightly different variation. So here by sacrificing and then trading, Stubben has immediately created a large center, a protected advance pawn in e6. So the problem now with this knight on f6 is very annoying because if he pushes g5, the h5 pawn hangs. So Horde coach willing to sacrifice the b knight. He doesn't have to take. I'm not quite sure the logic of this move because, obviously he doesn't have to take. If he doesn't take, I'm not sure what. So now pressing the issue because now the knight is threatening the e pawn, and now another one. So if he pushes e6, so does he sacrifice the knight right away on e5? Okay, so as opposed to a normal rook shuffle pattern where usually you open up on the A file. We've gotten into a holding pattern where Stubborn only has 2 pawns on the D and E file, and Horde Coach has his A and B and G and H pawns, and Stubborn will have to sacrifice a pawn very soon. So all the options are on the table. He could first try playing G5 and allowing the rook to come up on the H file to advance some of the G pawns. He could play F3. So the pawns advance a little bit more. I mean, you could get D4 and E6 in, but then eventually this the D file probably is going to be the one that's weakened here. And Stubborn, as I said, these are kind of the Zugzwang type positions. So Black is not actively threatening or attacking anything. I mean, obviously he could potentially take the pawn on H4, but it's not worth it. So now Stubborn has to decide how he's going to go forward. He's going to be into a forced Zugzwang. Within 2 moves, there'll be forced Zugzwang, and we'll see how he decides to move forward. If he moves forward with C5, then the D5 pawn will fall. If he tries moving forward E6, E5, the same E pawn. So that's the main threat right now, is to sack the bishop on D5 once the C or E pawns advance forward. He could also try advancing forward on F6, and then the bishop sack, and then the E file will be thinned down to 1 pawn. But White will be able to advance. Okay, so Horde Coach decides to sack the bishop, and I think this might be penetrating. If he takes back the bishop, queen takes, he has to play F4 and then queen takes pawn. And so, okay, this is also penetrating. Because if he takes the bishop back, queen H4, so he could. Okay, very interesting. There's still play here. He could take the rook on H5. He brings the rook over to the C file to prevent C5 and coming forward. So the pawns in the center are immobilized. The C file cannot be pushed to protect. F4 cannot be played because of the pawn on E4 would be hanging. He may have also considered just pushing C4. So this game looks very good for Horde Coach. Stubenfisch only has 5 pawns on Horde Coach's side of the board, and D files down to 1 pawn, E file down to 2 pawns. Probably rook takes D6 is probably immediately winning, but he doesn't even have to do it because the E5 pawn is dropping. He probably could have played rook takes D6, which would have been winning, but here just he doesn't even have to sacrifice the rook, and he could pick off the E pawn. I mean, he still probably will end up sacrificing the rook on D7, but he doesn't have to. You sacrifice the bishop. Yeah, so it's a superior strategy. Bishop takes on E6, and then all 3 of these pawns drop, and it should be no issue. So Horde Coach playing very cautiously here, wants to lock in the victory. We're approaching the second half of the match already. So Horde Coach taking a 4-3 lead with this game very cautiously. And as you notice here, you could combine the power of the queen and the rook. So now the queen and the rook will prevent the pawns from advancing, because if the b pawn advances, then the queen takes on h6, and so this is just GG. In fact, the rook could start coming from behind. The king stops these pawns. Um, so b5. Okay, it's just sacks. So okay, Horde coach takes the lead. Okay, so now we're back. We had two games where white won. Game 1 and 2. Game 3 and 4, white won. And of the other 5 games, black has won, which is common. Okay, so Stubborn goes straight into I call a holding pattern. I guess, Diablo, some people are using the word fortress. You call this a fortress defense holding pattern. And the idea is just to force studs wing. So as opposed to an active strategy of trying to break through on the A or H file in a top play, it's very difficult. The top players usually know how to prevent um, the A or H file from being forced open. So, I mean, Stubborn could do a bunch of sacrifices. He could play knight takes A5 and the queen takes, and then, try to get the C pawn. But at higher level play, you're more likely to see these holding pattern fortresses, which is just the zugzwang defense, forcing your opponent to come forward into your sacrifices that will open up one of the files. So here the E file has already been thinned to 2 pawns. So now Stubborn just has to decide the best placement of his pieces, because Horde coach center pawns, we'll probably see over the next few moves all of these center pawns advancing as far as they can, and Stubborn has to decide the best placement of his pieces. So yeah, if he brings his bishop to f7, that prevents, because now e5 cannot be played without the threat of knight takes d4. We'll probably see a knight takes d4, and he allows it. So now he's been thinned to 2 pawns on each file, and the continuation. Okay, so Stubborn there sacrifices on c4 for just 1 pawn in order to get the queen in. And I'm not sure the follow-up here. I'm sure that's a strategic move because, obviously the c pawn can't move. Maybe the bishop will eventually threaten to take on c5. So I'm assuming that he's got to keep the queen there. Okay, yeah, so that's the threat. Rook takes b4. So rook takes b4 will be penetrating, because you see rook takes b4, a takes b4, and because he needs 2 pawns on the c file, the queen will go back and forth between b4 and a4 to force penetration. So now queen to a4, b3, and then queen to a3, and Stubborn will penetrate behind the pawns. Yeah, he could even take the a5 pawn off first. It doesn't slow him down because now, um, so just see strategically there that this was the threat. The c pawn couldn't advance, and eventually the rook was going to sacrifice on b4, forcing penetration. And here Stubenfisch takes the pawn at a5 first, just to remove one of his opponent's most advanced pawns. And this looks almost certainly winning for black here. what does Stubben want to do with the bishop? Does he bring it to g7 to hold on to it, e7, and just allowing it to be taken? So now if d6, he would probably just allow the bishop to be taken. A lot of times, as I said, when say he plays d6 and if he plays bishop takes d6, that gives a tempo. Although here he'd probably be able to capture the pawns, both pawns with his king. But by taking it, it allows a tempo. Although he could hold on to these pawns. So d5 coming. Um, so if Stubenfisch didn't have the a pawn, because the queen could come back, and then the other queen. So I think Stubben probably would have been winning even if he didn't have the a pawn. But with the a pawn, and now two queens, uh, he's not even going to have to sacrifice one of the queens. So we'll see. Horde coach probably resign soon, and we'll see if we get another rook shuffle on e6. He'll probably sacrifice the queen, and then he doesn't actually have to sacrifice the queen, but I assume he's going to sacrifice the queen. But he could just play king c, c6, c8, or c6 even, and these pawns are going to fall. Okay, so another rook shuffle probably. Part of the reason I was streaming this is because Horde Coach is one of the big experts in the rook shuffle now. So we have another variation. This one, I think came up from more chess, who came up with this sacrifice. Obviously, I have the mate thread here, which I think when Horde Coach used to be fantastic, I think he actually fell for this mate a few times just because a lot of times he played very quickly. But as opposed, you sacrifice the pawn right away. So it's basically the same position. I'm not sure what difference the pawn sack in the beginning made. Maybe it wasn't even a sacrifice. So so the last few games we get pawn takes rook first. So in this case, Stubenfisch did not play pawn takes rook right away and played b4 first. So if he takes the rook and then the knight, we will see penetration. Okay. Yeah, so this line usually does not leave enough time for black to bring the queen behind the pawns. So I'm not sure Horde Coach's strategy here, because you're trying to play like queen a8 and get the queen behind the pawns is probably too slow. So although, how does he prevent an eventual d6 here? So I'm not sure where Horde Coach went wrong here. I mean, he probably should have went. I think he went wrong somewhere. And said like these moves. This is really still opening prep here. So this period here, where finally White goes for it, and the Zugzwang, the rook shuffle, and eventually White is Zugzwang, has to go forward and sacrifice a pawn. This is somewhat opening prep here, even though it's in the move 40s, and I'm not sure Horde coach went about it right here, because this is not looking good for. However, still, it is a Zugzwang type position. Said if either rook moves without a freeing move, if Horde coach, if Stubben had another move here, I mean the king probably could have just moved, but so f6 is the other break, and what does he do? Does he play? I mean the problem is, if he plays f5, then the queen and pawn will take on d5, and he could play c7, and if he pushes d6, the e6 pawn is hanging. And there's the possibility of bishop takes c5, and then queen to e5. So Horde coach, but it's pretty dangerous here. It's pretty dangerous here. I would have to say this is probably favoring Stubben, but there's still a lot of play in it. One mistake on either side could change the tide of the game. Both players preserve their time. Stubben now trying to find the right strategy. So I have the feeling that he will not be moving his knight. I mean, the knight could go back to g8, but then the question, if he doesn't move the knight, what does he do? He's got to make a move. So I mean, he could also, so bringing the rook back. So a lot of these threats, like we had in the other game, g7 is a serious threat when the bishop's not there, because the king can't run to f8 to stop it. The pawn stops it. So he brings the rook back. Now he has d6. Although, is it a move too late? What can Horde coach do here? But still, okay, in order to not lose the queen, he has to move to e8. If he moves to c8 or d8, he would be able to fork the queen. So king over. Unfortunately for Horde coach, this is not looking good. So Stubben could win the match. If he wins this game, he'll have the last black and he resigns. So I'm not sure where he went wrong there. We could look at the games after. This almost wrapping up. So okay, got Rune. Let me see if more chess wants to join. I think Horde coach is Rune's student, so I put the link in the chat if Rune wants to give some commentary. So Stubben goes for the same white square fortress holding pattern as we saw in the last game for the championship. I mean, after this Stubenfisch, if he wins this, we'll have to play Matvey, and the winner of that will play Horace, who pulled off the amazing upset against Matvey. And so the final will be with Horus 88, who I got to admit, like I beat him even last night in the arena. Um, like I consider myself in the second tier of players. Uh, Stubborn, Mindhunter. These players beat me about 4 out of 5 games. As where Horus maybe just slightly has the better of me, but he pulled off an upset against Matvey, and he will be the one playing in the finals. So Stubborn, the winner of this match, will play Matvey from Russia, and the winner of that match in the finals will be playing Horus 88. And we'll see if more chess wants to join. I put the StreamYard link in the chat, or Horde Coach himself, or anyone who wants to discuss this afterwards. If you want, I'll try to look at the games or. So if you wanted to go for the white square holding pattern, okay, so Horde Coach plays A6 to change the nature. Well, you still get a basic holding pattern here where Horde Coach still has 4 E pawns and 3 D pawns. So I think this looks good for white. I don't know if he's going to sack both knights here. Okay, so now this pawn falls because if D5, rook takes C6, can't take back because the queen would take on D1. And presumably Stubborn could open up the A file because the rook could come back to A6, the bishop to D7, and sack on A4, and then the queen battery. So does Horde Coach have a quick enough attack on the king side if Stubborn decides to penetrate on the A file? Because all Stubborn will have to stop will be, left will be, the king rook, the king bishop, the dark squared bishop, the G6 pawn will be traded very quickly. And so Stubborn does not decide to make the battery on the H file. He still may go for, so the D file is thinned here. So Stubborn decides not to go for the A file penetration and to keep the queen for defense and to continue with a, okay, I see now. So he could actually penetrate on the H file. Okay, so you see the quick reversal. The queen could have made a battery on the A file, but Stubborn, I guess, decides his king file is weaker, as the center and king side was more advanced. So if he penetrates on the H file, he will have an easier time defending the king side, and he will be able to preserve both bishops in this case. So, Stubborn decides not to open the H file. And I guess he still can because Stubborn can just play rook takes H3 here. Because take back the queen. Oh, actually, he can't. It doesn't work like that. He has to prepare it with queen H6 because the pawn is still on E1 defending F2. If the pawn was on E2, then he could have just taken the pawn right away. So presumably Horde Coach has to start advancing on the queen side. Little tricks here. Stubborn could have traded off the G6 pawn because he didn't. But can he still penetrate? Well, interesting game. Stubborn kind of fumbled around. I mean, he could have penetrated on the A file, then he could have penetrated on the H file, and he kept on bringing the queen back. And now there is no penetration on the H file. He could still. Okay, I think Horde coach probably made a mistake that one. He probably had to play F3 first. We didn't have much time. That was probably a costly mistake. It might cost him the match. For a second, it looked like he may have been back in the match, but it doesn't look like enough. I mean, because Stubborn still has the dark squared bishop. These pawns here are extremely slow. You're pushing. He can't even push c5. He can't even get in with c5 because the bishop. So this looks like Stubborn's game. So now he eventually gets in c5. And the king. Okay, this was a tight match. So see how Stubborn decides to defend it. And there's still minor chance for tricks, but not really. The rook is just going to come back to, the queen comes back, the king could come to c7 now, and the rook could just sacrifice on b7. You didn't have to. Is there still another rematch? He sent a rematch, but I think that's the end of the match. I think it's just a 10-game match. Stubborn won 6-4. So to look at the rules, maybe it's a 12-game match. I thought it was just a 10-game match. So let me see how many games there are. Okay, so let's put in the chat, see if anyone answers. Just a handful of people watching. King of Horde, well, the non-other top players. I don't think he played in the championship. You see, you got Horus88 here also. He will be the one in the finals who pulled off an upset against Matve. Okay, so it's first to 6.5. Okay, so Stubborn just needs a draw. Horde coach still in it. And what? Horde coach did not do the rook shuffle here. Okay, so Stubborn has 3 pawns in the C, D, and E file. Horde coach will unlikely be able to penetrate here. I mean, conceivably, he could try bringing his B knight around to the king side to force through, but more likely he will try to enter some sort of holding pattern, although Stubborn has 3 pawns in both the E and D file. So whatever his prep was here, I'm not sure. I think taking on D5, I'm not sure if that was a good strategy because that allowed it didn't take the opportunity to thin out. one of the files and then pushing c5 right away. I mean, he still has some sort of holding pattern here. But because Stubenfisch has 3 pawns in the E and D file here, he'll probably be able to safely advance at least to the fifth rank, some of the pawns to the 6th rank. So where does Horde coach make his stand? Okay, they're fumbling around, moving the knight around. So if he had stayed there, so by moving the knight back to f8, he allowed e5 because the knight on d7 was preventing it. Although I guess he saw that that wasn't the best place to make a stand. Maybe the knight will rework to g6. Maybe Horde coach has to get the king out of the way. Okay, so he castles. And, so now if e4, the knight and rook will be hitting the f4 pawn. Stubben could consider advancing on the d file, although that may be weakening. Okay, so we will have a Zugzwang situation here. So Stubben, presumably he's going to sack on f4 here. And now the f file has been reduced to just 2 pawns. And you might have a queen battery. So, yeah, I don't like that move of Stubenfisch there. I mean, maybe he wanted to defend the h4 pawn, but I mean, if he played f3, I mean, he could have been being penetrated no matter what. So now, Horde coach will penetrate on the f file, and Stubenfisch's queen side is not very far advanced. So I think Horde coach will be winning this game. So tough to say. Like, he probably should just take on f2. At this point, he probably has to go for it. He has to go take on f2. Here he takes on c4. I'm not sure. He probably had to just take on f2 with the queen. Now what's the plan? Now he's going to be able to safen up. I mean, okay, I guess he still may be able to penetrate. Yeah, I do not like the way Horde coach played that. I think he had to. I mean, obviously, it was a little bit dangerous here. To if he takes, then c6 and b6 and e6 are coming very quickly. But here now he's not even going to penetrate, and this should be Stubben's game. I'm not sure. It could be. He was scared. Maybe the penetration, the queen side pawns were coming quickly. There's still some minor possibilities for Horde coach, but not much. Because he could just advance on the queen side here. Okay, some minor possibility. Threatening take the f3 pawn. I think d3 was winning there. I thought d3 should have just been winning because d7, but this is probably also winning. Although Stubben's just got a few seconds. So the problem is that, okay, and this is mating. This is forcing the queen sacrifice. So Stubenfisch will be playing Matvey next round in the Horde World Championship. If I'm available, I will be streaming that. So we'll look at the game. So that's mate, and I think that will be the last game. So see if Horde coach could have played that better. Yeah, it looks like White got the advantage. He's kind of fumbling around with the knight. Can't figure out which holding pattern he wants to go for. However, maybe it's still a game. It's tough to see. Could have C5 or what the right strategy was. But here he penetrates, and yeah, I didn't like this move. G3 penetrates. Okay, so taking was a mistake. So if you notice here, taking, like I said, you're just sacrificing the pawn slows it down because taking advances White's pawn. So you probably should have just taken right away. Rook takes e4. So that was an interesting move. Okay, so Horde coach had rook takes e4, and then if d takes, queen takes, and that's going to stop the pawns. And then at this point, queen takes f2, the computer likes, and this should be winning. But after queen takes c5, it's it's just White's game, and Stubben wins. Okay, so I guess I'm here streaming, so I'll do a quick review of all the games. Let's start with game one. So you have the basic rook shuffle. So here he plays h5, and the problem with h5 is it allows a little bit more advancement on the king side, but a lot of times it just transposes. There's no difference. But in this case, Stubben played a different variation. He plays the d6 pawn sacrifice, and then b6. So d6, b6 in order to get the advanced pawn on d6. But the rook shuffle continues, and Horde coach decides to sacrifice the knight. He's not forced to sacrifice the knight, but he decides to. And Horde coach won this game pretty handily. So the first game, Horde coach won pretty handily. Stubben didn't even really get much counterplay. Second game, Stubben just did a general central thinning strategy. So my computer likes Black's position already, and just saying he is able to thin the E file down. Horde coach allows it, and pretty handily you wins here without much counterplay. So games 1 and 2, both sides won with Black without much counterplay. Game 3, you had another rook shuffle, and here you have the main line of the rook shuffle with the White pawn strategy and the eventual b6 push, forking the king and queen. So say this is basically the main line of the rook shuffle. Here, waiting for the rook to be on b7, otherwise the queen could retreat to a7. So you have to wait for the rook to be on a7 to push. And is that sometimes you could advance the kingside pawns first by pushing g5, but Stubben does not do that. And yeah, I think knight a6 is a key move. So people new to the rook shuffle often miss this move, knight a6. And if you don't find knight a6 here, it's really bad. You're sacrificing the rook takes, and this is already really good for black. I'm not even sure if this is an opening book, if it's the, but Horde Coach makes this mistake twice. So if you notice here, the computer is saying either queen a6 or queen b5, and the reason is simple. You're going to take this pawn on d3, but by playing to b3, it allows d6 right away. Oh, my computer's fan's going because I got the computer going, so I hope the fan's not too loud. But this mistake is costly because it allows d6. Had he played queen b5, the pawn on d6 is going to fall, and then the pawn on d4 is going to fall, and before he could play d6. So this is an extremely costly mistake. So like I said, if he plays queen b5 and then he plays d6, then the c6 pawn falls and it's basically GG. And if he does something else, so say here, and then d6, then the d4 pawn falls. So unfortunately, Horde Coach messed up his prep, and queen b6 allows d6 right away, and then d5, and now it's still a game. And I guess it's saying he should play something like queen d4 and maybe just enter a holding strategy of just keeping the queen on these two squares. But here taking these pawns, so I don't know, the computer's saying d7 first, but this seems sufficient. You're just advancing the pawn, d7, push, and this is already GG. And I think so. I mean, Horde Coach had his chances. To some extent, that's prep. I'm not sure if so unfortunately, Horde Coach had his chances. Stubben did not play perfectly, and here you have Stubben doing a similar holding pattern. I mean, bishop b6. I guess it's the computer. No, the computer doesn't recommend it. Although the computer is fluctuating. I mean, it would seem that bishop b6 is a dubious move, but I mean, sure, Stubben had his ideas because he's going to be able to trap it as where it could have went back. But I guess he really wanted to keep pressure on this d4 pawn, and so here he takes it. So, I mean, what would have happened if he played like this? I guess it's not good because c6. So if he does that c6, so so now he's thinned the e pawn down to just one, and okay, I got my MacBook. It's giving me depth in the 20s. And so here, he just waits. He could have taken f5 there. Could have taken f6. So Stubben lost this game. So you see, like, I mean, he could have played knight f3 and then the queen penetrating. He could have played knight takes f5 right away here. And I'm not sure why he didn't. And then here, he could have played rook takes f6 right away and didn't. And so he waited a few extra moves that allowed the queen side to advance, and then he's working with his knight. As opposed to getting the queen behind the pawns, he brings his queen back, and white is just better here. There was one point where I thought white misplayed here. Yeah, I thought he should have played c4 here. So c4, huge mistake here. He has 15 seconds here, but huge mistake, allowing the knight to take on c3, but it's still winning. Just c4 would have been a much clearer path to victory, but still, because the kingside pawn, so queen b6. So, okay, I see. So the computer is saying better to, the knight can't stop the two pawns. So the queen has to go to the queen side, and the knight has to attempt to slow down the pawns, and then possibly the d pawn could have advanced. But Stubben chose the wrong strategy, and here, it's over. The pawn will be able to queen, and GG. So there you have the two white victories. Okay, game 5, back to the rook shuffle. Main line variation. Some recommend, I see Mindhunter was a little more careful with like pushing these pawns right away. There's some small nuances, but eventually you're going to get to this position where white plays c5 and then b6. So here, sometimes c2 might be a better move than c3, because the pawn will defend, because this pawn on d3 is the one that gets picked off. But it's small nuance. I see Mindhunter used to sometimes play c2 instead of c3. So here you get the main line variation. And say, so here you could start pushing the kingside pawns, as opposed to winning the rook right away. So even here, so if you don't take the pawn right away, I think the rook is going to move to like b7 and force. But I think Mindhunter, maybe other players I've seen would have pushed g5 and tried to advance on the king side here. But this is just penetrating. And Horde coach makes the same mistake again, but this time he wins anyways by trading. So last time he took the d3 pawn right away, but here trading still. Okay, so I guess computer's saying taking with the c pawn is better, and computer prefers knight f6, just to take on d5 right away. So I think this caused unnecessary. Knight f6 was, I don't know why, knight f6 just seems substantially better. So I don't know the reason for knight e7, if it's another just mistake. And so now Stubben he's back in the game. So Stubben is winning here. He has mate here. So I thought there was a mate. So e5 is just GG. Or is it? Yeah, e5 is just winning. You can't stop the queen. You can't stop the queening now. So e5 here would have been winning. d6 is also winning. D7. I guess it wants him to play g3 right away for g3, f4, and to attack the king. But this should also be winning. And here b6 is a preferable move. I guess allowing him to. So if on b6, I see. So on b6, the bishop can't. So if he plays b6 here, the bishop can't take because of b7. Or no, queen f4 is stopping. So f4 anyway. Okay, it's a little unclear here, but you should still be winning here. Yeah, so this is what I said. f4 is just winning here. So here f4, threatening to fork. If queen takes f4, b6, and if the queen comes back, here it's saying h4. Trying to see. So this is a little bit interesting. I mean, so no wonder Stubben didn't find this. I mean, what happens if he just takes? Okay, yeah, the computer's really this running the computer here is really overheating my computer, but he does not find the best continuation here, allowing the e7 pawn to be taken, but this should still be winning. Okay, so here it's just saying b6. So here was the last chance. So here b6, and if bishop takes d7, ex d7, and I guess if he plays king takes here, pawn takes rook, and c7 is winning. And so, the computer's saying you should play rook f8, but then c7 is also winning. And why is this winning? Queen x d7, yeah, g8 queen. Okay, so yeah, Stubben had victory there. I mean, it's difficult to find, especially with just a few seconds on the clock. And here is it still a game here? It's saying h5. I guess he had to advance. It's still saying white is winning here. This point, he's got to play a5. Some of that's extremely difficult. The balance between the right move on the king and queen side, but still, white has an advantage here. But at this point now, it's over. Okay, so that was an intense game. The rook shuffle, Horde coach pulls through that game. And now Stubenfisch. Yeah, this was the line I said where I sometimes just play knight a5 in order in that where Stubben kind of fumbled around, not penetrating. Yeah, so it just seems like knight a4 is obvious here. I mean, knight a4, computer says it's already -6. Penetration is very easy. And although, he still has a huge advantage. But Stubben, I guess he doesn't even have to penetrate. The holding strategy is sufficient here. I'm not sure why he decided not to penetrate. And eventually the holding strategy works anyways. And Stubben wins this game without much resistance. Okay, so here we're already on game 6 and game 8, and this will be the last game that Horde coach wins. Rook shuffle again. And against this d6 line here, it pays at this point to open up the center as opposed to allowing white to advance and going for a Zugzwang strategy. Yeah, I guess, if he plays knight x e5, fx e5, dx e5, dx everything. The whole center could have traded down here and thinned it down. So queen c7 is probably a mistake, but it's still sufficient, and thins down the center, and almost no counterplay. Easy victory for Horde Coach, and this is the last game that Horde Coach wins. So here the match was, Horde Coach was even up 4-3 here. No, so it was 4-4. So besides for the first game that Horde Coach won, Stubben came back the second game, and then Stubben was always 1 point ahead. So this is 4-4, and Stubben will win the. No, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. So Horde Coach took the lead here. Now it's 4-3. So if this Horde Coach takes the lead, although he had the first black, but that's the last game that Horde Coach wins. And here, Stubben just uses a Zugzwang holding pattern that I'm not sure if he had to allow this, why he chose to give up the d5 pawn like that. I mean, he could have pushed a few more pawns, but why he did it so quickly. Bishop c5. It's hard to see why this is such a good move, but so here it's even saying he could play this bishop takes c4 and sacrifice the other bishop, and then I guess it penetrating. So if he sacrificed the other bishop right away, but it doesn't matter because this is penetrating. And the rook will sack on b4 like I covered during the game, and this penetrates. And the counterplay is almost not evident. And then he's just able to queen for a quick victory. So although Horde Coach won with the rook shuffle, got some games, victories were definitely more decisive than Horde Coaches. So I mean, the match is still even here, but you're saying that most they're winning with black, but Stubben is winning much more convincingly with black than Horde Coach is. Okay, so here, if I mentioned, now he plays c2 instead of c3, although computer recommends c3. C2 in order that the d3 pawn isn't as weak. I think that's what Mindhunter used to play, although he played c3 anyways, I guess, just to force the rook onto a7. And okay, so unfortunately, instead of Horde Coach recognizing that his mistake was playing queen b3 instead of queen b5, he thought he was making some other mistake. So, as I pointed out, Horde Coach missed the right strategy of queen b5, preventing the pawn push, and like it wasn't working out like he thought it should have. So he further messed up his prep and then just chose knight takes c5, which is really not good at all. So now at this point, this is almost just winning for white. The queen cannot get behind the pawns. He pushes on f6, knight, and here it just has nothing, sacrifices, and it's just a painful loss, no counterplay. So it was unfortunate. Horde Coach, one of the best players of the rook shuffle, kind of blundered, not by queen b3 and kind of queen b5, and then not realizing what his blunder is, ended up playing something completely off and just lost that game. I think the last game he doesn't even play the rook shuffle, and I assume he's looking at his games. Maybe he'll watch this video, see what happened. So now Stubben, again, just a basic holding strategy here. So, I mean, this kind of tricky opening prep here, that's tough to realize that you're in a much worse position for white here, where he went wrong. So, I mean, here, A6, maybe he's getting kind of desperate. A6 turns out is not a very good move. And that the rook could come around. And here you could just penetrate on the A file. Horde coach maybe is tilting a little bit. This is the one where he ends up going to the H file anyways. So here he kind of stumbles. I thought that maybe he was coming back here a little bit, but I'm not sure. Maybe he didn't have anything better. So I mean, I guess G2, even if he had played G2, your black is still basically winning here. So, this point, finally the queen penetrates, and white's counterplay is way too slow. So, I mean, props to Stubben for his opening prep. With black, almost every game, he basically destroyed Horde coach with black almost every game besides for the fourth game. And then is the last game. Horde coach, not realizing what mistake he's making with the rook shuffle, decides to switch openings, and I'm not sure. C6, I guess, the move here is where he goes wrong here. I can't imagine C5. I mean, I guess it's still a game. Yeah, I don't think he wanted to take on B4. I mean, probably like B6 or something, but I mean, I can't imagine taking on B4 was the right idea. And now to play A5, Stubben just kind of has the easy game here. Horde coach doesn't have much of a chance to penetrate, although he still ends up penetrating. We looked at this game briefly. So it looks like E3 was a better move, but this might have been the same case anyway. And then here, just taking on F2 is probably better right away. But here, rook takes E4. So he missed the idea of rook takes E4, which would have been devastating. Because then if rook takes E4, taking the rook, queen takes, none of the pawns could really move. If he pushes C4, then the queen is going to be able to come through D4. And if he doesn't, then the bishop is going to take on D5, and this would have just been GG. And if he doesn't take the rook, this pawn's going to fall. I mean, it's recommending C6. The computer says just take on E5. And so unfortunately, Horde coach missed his win. And this point, after queen takes C4, C5, he's not going to be able to penetrate. So I said, like, this should be winning for white, though it's going to be difficult. Like I said, C6, bishop C8, these pawns are extremely quick. If he pushed the pawn too quickly, rook B8, or pushes this pawn too quickly, white could just start eating the pawns. But this was almost certainly the right strategy. But after this, he doesn't even get to penetrate, and Stubben wins the match. Okay, so props to Stubben. We'll see when he plays Matvey. So we should have match against Matvey coming up soon. Horde coach, former world champion. I'm not sure if he hasn't been playing that much to have kind of butchered his chess. I have my latest blog on Horde chess. I might try over the next few days over Thanksgiving weekend to write part two to Horde chess, an introduction to the Rook Shuffle with the basic ideas. It's almost got 2,000 viewership, 68 hearts. So, been speaking with a dude, the administrator in the Horde group. So I will try to write part two of Horde chess, and also my series on models of expertise. Continue with that, and I'm coaching here in Detroit. I haven't streamed in a while because I got a new job. I'm working in the Detroit public schools, so I didn't want to do anything too controversial, get myself into trouble. The war in Israel is raging on, and I kind of like reading these papers and this science of philosophy, but my viewership's not that high, so I might go back to reading the Stanford Encyclopedia or Week in Review and just reading scientific papers. um, I don't think there's much demand in the viewership, but I think it helps my mental progression in terms of like chunking theory. I've been talking with a few people on the Lee Chess server, ND Patzer, who has been one of the top guys on the server who's making posts about the science of chess, talking about chunking theory. So, having a little talk with him. But I would like to continue my research and continue on in research and have a lot more papers. I want Andre Erickson and Gagne and other fields. So we'll see if I get back to week in review. I just want to stabilize my position with the Detroit public schools. I don't want to do anything too controversial, but tendency to with the war going on or other things. So we'll see if I get back into that. So God bless. Shalom, namaste, Hare Krishna, best wishes, congratulations to Stubenfisch, good try, Horde coach. And if it's on a time that I can, fits my schedule, I will also stream the Matvey um, Stubenfisch match and then the final between Horace and either Matvey or Stubenfisch. And Stubenfisch has never been world champion. Matvey's been working really hard, tough player. Horace, big upset. I mean, one of the top players, but I say Horace is probably only one of the top 25 players so it was a big upset for him to beat Matvey in the finals. If he plays Matvey or Stubben, it would be another big upset for him to win first place. But he's working at it. Anything could happen. Preparation, um, divine providence, or whatever. So hopefully we'll be able to stream the next match and then the finals. So God bless. Have a great day. Leave any comments. Share, like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you again.